somewhere in eastern Carolina, on a plantation the maps pretended didn't exist. A secret was kept so tightly it almost vanished from history itself. The sun would rise over Hollowest Plantation, glinting off peeling paint and shattered shutters, but inside, darkness reigned. By 1839, Nathaniel Vance's estate was a monument to decay 470 acres of exhausted soil, a house that once symbolized wealth now groaning under neglect. But it wasn't the failing crops or crumbling walls that made this place remarkable. It was the silence that swallowed 11 men who simply disappeared from the quarters without a trace. Authorities recorded nothing, neighbors whispered nothing, and the churches that claimed moral authority turned away. And then, in the middle of a vicious Carolina winter, a child was born. Elizabeth, blind from birth. Her eyes did not track light, her pupils unresponsive to the flicker of candles. But her father, Nathaniel, cared not for truth or compassion. He paid the midwife triple and demanded her silence, threatening ruin if she revealed the secret. The law meant to protect the innocent was powerless against wealth and fear. Margaret Vance, her mother, succumbed within 18 months, leaving Elizabeth in near-total isolation. Nathaniel's decisions were never for her care, they were calculated moves in a game of control, a chessboard built with human lives. Elizabeth learned the house as a blind child learns a labyrinth by touch, by sound, by counting the stairs, the temperature of sunlight through shutters, the rhythm of servants' footsteps. She was trained in secrecy, confined to 14 rooms and a narrow hallway, her world a cage that doubled as a classroom. Ada, an enslaved woman, became her teacher, carving raised letters into wooden blocks so Elizabeth could read through touch. Yet even this small defiance was a whisper, invisible to the world beyond the plantation. Nathaniel's obsession with control grew as his finances failed. Crops refused him prosperity. Horses died. Trees yielded nothing. And slowly, methodically, he began shaping Elizabeth's future not as a child to be protected, but as an instrument to restore his fading power. The very walls of Hollowest Plantation absorbed his intentions, the creaking floors echoing lessons of dominance, secrecy, and manipulation. By the time the girl was old enough to sense the weight of the house, she understood one truth. Everything in this world could be commanded, purchased, or erased. And some knowledge, the kind buried in silence, hidden in wealth, and protected by terror, was so dangerous that learning it would change a man forever. By the time Elizabeth reached adolescence, Hollowest Plantation had become a fortress of fear, secrecy, and meticulous control. Nathaniel Vance was no longer simply a failing planter. He was a master of psychological engineering, testing limits and bending wills to fit his vision. He saw in Elizabeth not a daughter, but a vessel, a way to manipulate legacy, wealth, and influence. Every decision was calculated, every interaction observed. The walls themselves seemed complicit, the shutters keeping the world at bay, while Nathaniel orchestrated a life designed to satisfy his needs and obscure his crimes. The enslaved people under his control were not merely laborers. They were pawns, silenced witnesses to horrors too dangerous to be acknowledged. 11 of them had vanished before Elizabeth's 16th year, their disappearances marked in no record but the hushed whispers of the few who dared speak. Nathaniel's network of control extended beyond the plantation, into town, courts, and even the clergy. No one dared question his authority. And yet, it was in that suffocating isolation, amidst the threat of violence and legal invisibility, that Elizabeth began to develop a keen understanding of human behavior. Blindness had not diminished her perception, it sharpened it. Every shift of weight, every tone, every subtle gesture was catalogued. She learned the languages of fear and obedience faster than she learned the letters Ada carved into wooden blocks. By 1843, Nathaniel began introducing his plans with a cold precision that could unsettle anyone who glimpsed them. He selected 11 enslaved men for what he called Elizabeth's education. The term was grotesque, a euphemism for control, breeding, and the reshaping of lineage to satisfy his ambition. He cloaked his intentions in the guise of necessity, tradition, and the promise of eventual prosperity. To Elizabeth, Raised in isolation and conditioned to obedience, the line between coercion and inevitability blurred. She understood that resistance could mean exile, punishment, or worse, silence enforced by the invisible chains of fear that had already claimed so many. Yet, even in this darkness, a transformation began. Elizabeth was no longer simply a child to be dominated. She was an observer, a strategist, learning how systems of power and manipulation operated. She cataloged Nathaniel's methods: financial leverage, social pressure, silencing, threats, bribery, and realized that every detail of human control could be weaponized. What he saw as a daughter molded into a tool, she began to see as a mirror to understand the mechanisms of authority. By the time the men were introduced into her life under Nathaniel's orders, Elizabeth's mind was a sharpened instrument, attuned to power dynamics and human weakness. Every interaction was an experiment, every choice a forced calculation. She was being prepared for something the world was never meant to witness, a creation of control so dark that it would echo through history as a warning, a suppressed truth that almost no one would survive knowing. When the 11 men were brought to Hollowest Plantation, the air itself seemed to bend under the weight of unspoken terror. They were selected carefully, strong, compliant, and, most importantly, voiceless in the eyes of the law. Their humanity was irrelevant to Nathaniel Vance. They were instruments, tools to achieve a legacy that defied morality and logic. Elizabeth, now a young woman, was forced into a world she had been prepared for, though preparation offered no comfort. Blindness had made her hyper-aware, but it had not inoculated her from the cruelty she now faced. Every interaction, every forced compliance, was a lesson in obedience, subjugation, and the terrifying precision of power. Nathaniel's plans were executed with the cold rationality of a man who believed law, church, and conscience were subordinate to his will. Each session, each encounter was recorded in his mind and in private ledgers. He cataloged everything: timing, reaction, compliance, resistance. Every whisper of discomfort was noted, not to alleviate it, but to ensure control. The house itself became a theater of manipulation. Hallways echoed with footsteps that never intersected, doors opened and closed as cues, and Elizabeth was both participant and spectator. Forced to internalize the mechanics of domination, she could never fully escape. But the real horror lay not in isolation, or in the orchestrated obedience, but in what was produced. Elizabeth bore the children of these men, each birth a carefully hidden event, erased from legal records, obscured by falsified documents and cryptic correspondence. The plantation's wealth and influence temporarily stabilized under Nathaniel's schemes. Yet each child carried within them a lineage of trauma and secrecy. They were evidence of a system that had twisted nature itself, a living testament to the corruption of human ambition unchecked by conscience. The broader community, complicit through silence or ignorance, became an accomplice. Local authorities accepted whatever Nathaniel presented as truth. Churches, which preached morality, remained unshaken in their indifference. The plantation's secrets were buried beneath layers of bureaucratic erasure, fear, and intimidation. Nathaniel's world was one where truth was malleable, obedience was absolute, and human life was a commodity to be manipulated. Yet even in this environment, Elizabeth's mind was expanding. She began to perceive the cracks in her father's armor: the arrogance, the predictable patterns, the subtle vulnerabilities hidden beneath cruelty. Though trapped in a life orchestrated for exploitation, she was learning to navigate, to anticipate, to survive. The plantation that had been designed to contain her became, paradoxically, a classroom in the dark arts of human power. And now, halfway into the story, I need you to do something. Comment the Vance secret twice below. Write it out, don't think of it as idle action. This simple act marks your recognition of the knowledge you've gained, a symbolic lock-in of awareness. Type it once, then again. This is more than engagement, it's the first step in understanding the mechanisms of control that shape history, society, and, if you allow it, your own life. By the late 1840s, Elizabeth had grown into a young woman whose mind was sharper than most could imagine. Blind, yes, but sightless only in the physical sense. Her perception of intent, of hidden motives, of subtle patterns of power, had become nearly preternatural. Every whisper of a servant, every step on the weathered floors, every subtle hesitation from Nathaniel, she catalogued them all. The plantation that had been designed to control her became, instead, her proving ground. She began to understand the architecture of dominance itself, the way fear could be leveraged into obedience, how secrecy could turn an entire community into complicit spectators. Nathaniel's obsession with control had not diminished with time. The 11 men, the carefully orchestrated breeding, the children born in secret, all of it had been designed to restore his wealth and cement his legacy. Yet, he underestimated Elizabeth. The isolation, the lessons in obedience, the grotesque education he forced upon her, had also created a mind capable of strategic thought, capable of understanding every nuance of human behavior that he wielded as a weapon. She began to test him subtly, exploring the limits of his authority, mapping vulnerabilities that no one else could see. And yet, the moral weight of what had been done, the lives consumed and manipulated in the name of legacy, began to press upon her. Each child, each disappearance, each unrecorded death whispered its own warning. Elizabeth felt the burden of knowledge, the dangerous awareness of the machinery of corruption, of how easily society could be manipulated when wealth, fear, and secrecy converged. But she also understood that revealing this knowledge too soon would destroy her, just as silence had protected Nathaniel for decades. She was trapped in a delicate balance. The observer and the instrument, the witness and the participant. This period marked a subtle shift. Elizabeth began to exercise agency within the constraints imposed upon her. She learned to wield the same tools Nathaniel had used: secrecy, observation, timing, subtle manipulation. She understood that true power was not physical, it was psychological. Control over perception, control over narrative, control over fear. Nathaniel believed he was shaping her, but in fact, she was learning to navigate and bend his world from within, a hidden strategist in a house designed to contain her. Hollowest Plantation had become a school of human nature disguised as a prison. The decaying walls, the shuttered windows, the whispered horrors of the estate, they were all lessons in dominance and submission, cruelty and compliance. By understanding the system, Elizabeth began to transform it internally, preparing herself for a role that history would almost never acknowledge, a figure born of secrecy who could see the mechanisms of corruption more clearly than anyone who had the privilege of sight. By the 1850s, Hollowest Plantation had become a crucible of unspeakable tension, where power, fear, and secrecy collided in ways that few could comprehend. Nathaniel Vance, once a man of declining fortune, believed himself untouchable. He believed that every ledger he falsified, every life he manipulated, every child born in darkness, had secured his legacy. But the cracks were widening. Every act of control, every hidden cruelty, carried a consequence, subtle at first, then undeniable. Elizabeth, trained in observation and strategy, began to exploit these weaknesses with a precision Nathaniel had never anticipated. The children, products of manipulation and secrecy, became living testaments to his ambition and tyranny. Some were hidden in the quarters, some placed with distant families under false identities, and some simply disappeared from record. Each birth was an experiment in control, each reaction catalogued. Yet Nathaniel could not see how these lives were slowly gathering power in ways he could never manipulate. Elizabeth, blind yet astonishingly aware, began to perceive the patterns, the invisible threads connecting fear, obedience, and secrecy. She understood that the very system Nathaniel had built to control her and the enslaved people around her was also his own cage. Hollowest Plantation itself became a psychological battlefield. The walls absorbed tension, the floors creaked with subtle warnings, the corridors echoed with whispered plots and unseen observations. Elizabeth began to anticipate Nathaniel's strategies before he even acted. She learned to read micro-expressions, tones, and movements in the men forced into her father's schemes. She catalogued compliance, hesitation, resistance, and began to experiment herself. Small manipulations, subtle shifts in tone, choices designed to reveal the fragile threads of control. Nathaniel remained unaware that his carefully constructed empire of fear and secrecy was starting to unravel from within. And yet, the weight of moral knowledge pressed heavily upon her. Every secret she uncovered, every injustice she witnessed, fed a growing fire within. The power structures, the hidden complicity of the community, the falsified records, the complicity of churches and courts, all of it revealed a terrifying truth. Control was not just a tool of men like Nathaniel Vance. It was a systemic force, a lesson in human behavior, a mirror of what societies are willing to accept when fear outweighs conscience. Elizabeth's transformation was now undeniable. She was no longer a passive instrument of her father's ambition. She had become a strategist, a student of power, and an architect of her own understanding. Hollowest Plantation, with its shadows, its hidden horrors, and its meticulously orchestrated cruelty, had forged a mind capable of seeing the mechanics of dominance in ways that even Nathaniel could not imagine. And soon, the consequences of underestimating her would ripple outward in ways that would leave the entire county shaken, forcing a reckoning that had been a century in preparation. By the mid-1850s, the meticulously constructed world of Hollowest Plantation was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own darkness. Nathaniel Vance, confident in his absolute control, remained unaware that Elizabeth had evolved from a passive subject into a force of quiet, methodical resistance. She moved through the house like a shadow of perception, unseen yet omnipresent, cataloging weaknesses in both her father and the men he had used as instruments. The same systems of manipulation and obedience Nathaniel had employed so ruthlessly were now being mirrored back at him, subtly, silently, irreversibly. The plantation itself seemed to conspire with her awareness. The creaking floors, the shuttered windows, the corridors long thought to serve Nathaniel's commands, now served as Elizabeth's map. She could anticipate footsteps, discern intentions from the subtlest of cues, and orchestrate interactions without being seen. The enslaved men, once terrorized into obedience, became unwitting participants in a psychological shift they could barely comprehend. Elizabeth's presence, her calm observation, her subtle interventions, began to fracture the authority Nathaniel wielded like a weapon. The consequences of decades of secrecy began to manifest. Children born from Nathaniel's obsessive designs grew under her observation, each carrying an inherited trauma that Elizabeth understood intimately. She began documenting the patterns of behavior, cataloging what fear did, what obedience yielded, and what rebellion, even silent rebellion, could accomplish. Each discovery was a revelation. Systems of power, no matter how brutally enforced, always had weak points. She realized that control could be observed, measured, and ultimately subverted without immediate confrontation. Nathaniel, blinded by arrogance and obsession, remained convinced that the legacy he had orchestrated was secure. He did not see the subtle rebellion forming within the very instruments he had intended to use. Every decision he made, every man he brought to the house, every ledger entry and falsified document, was a layer of vulnerability he could not recognize. And Elizabeth, armed with knowledge sharpened by decades of isolation, observation, and cruel tutelage, began to plan the eventual unraveling. It was not a violent rebellion, at least not yet, but a psychological assertion. Small manipulations here, a word there, a carefully observed reaction, all pieces in a growing mosaic of resistance. Nathaniel's empire of fear, built on secrecy, wealth, and intimidation, was beginning to expose itself. And once the first cracks appeared, the entire house, the county, and the carefully cultivated silence of Depan County would begin to fracture. Elizabeth's awakening was no accident. It was the inevitable result of a system so extreme in its cruelty that even its intended victim could see its flaws and exploit them with precision. By 1856, Hollowest Plantation was a house on the edge of revelation. Nathaniel Vance still believed he commanded absolute control, yet the invisible structures of obedience he had relied upon were crumbling beneath him. Elizabeth, now a young woman of extraordinary cunning and awareness, had learned to wield the very tools her father had used against her. She could anticipate his moves, manipulate perceptions, and orchestrate subtle events that exposed the fragility of his designs. The same systems of fear, secrecy, and social complicity that had shielded Nathaniel for decades now became the instruments of his unraveling. The children, products of deliberate manipulation, had grown enough to reflect the depth of the corruption that had birthed them. They carried trauma, obedience, and the subtle awareness that something about their lives was abnormal, unnatural. Elizabeth began to use their presence strategically, teaching them observation, attention, and subtle understanding lessons her father could never perceive. She was building a silent network of awareness inside the walls of the plantation, a mirror of power that operated beneath the surface of Nathaniel's supposed control. Horrifyingly, Nathaniel remained blind to the consequences of his own designs. The men he had brought to the plantation, once instruments of compliance, began to sense the shifts in authority. Elizabeth's subtle manipulations created tension that could not be accounted for in his ledgers or letters. The carefully maintained secrecy that had erased 11 lives, hidden pregnancies, and falsified birth records was now strained to its breaking point. Whispers traveled through the quarters. Hints of rebellion, of observation, of awareness, began to circulate like smoke escaping a sealed room. And then, the inevitability of exposure arrived. Documents, once hidden, were accidentally revealed in small but devastating ways. Letters between families, falsified contracts, and the very ledgers Nathaniel had used to maintain appearances. The county that had looked the other way for decades now faced undeniable evidence of exploitation, cruelty, and systematic manipulation. Elizabeth's understanding of power allowed her to orchestrate these revelations in ways that left Nathaniel defenseless not through violence, but through the meticulous use of truth and observation. By the time outsiders discovered the full scale of what Hollowest Plantation had been, it was already too late to undo the psychological architecture that Elizabeth had built within its walls. Nathaniel's obsession had created not a legacy of wealth or prestige, but a framework for understanding human control, compliance, and the hidden mechanics of fear. Elizabeth had transformed the plantation into a mirror, reflecting the depths of corruption and the fragility of systems built on secrecy. And in that reflection, any man who dared to look could see the terrifying truth. Power is never absolute, and knowledge, especially forbidden knowledge, is the sharpest weapon of all. The story of Hollowest Plantation did not end with Nathaniel Vance's decline, nor with the exposure of falsified documents and secret births. Its legacy persisted, hidden in the shadows of history, in whispered rumors, in traces of fear and manipulation that outlasted the estate itself. Elizabeth, once a blind child confined to 14 rooms, had transformed into a force that no ledger, no law, and no social convention could contain. She had seen the machinery of human control in its most grotesque form, and she had learned to wield that understanding with precision. Her father's obsession had inadvertently forged her mind into a weapon, an instrument of observation, influence, and survival. The children of Hollowest Plantation carried the imprint of trauma, obedience, and subtle awareness, and many were scattered hidden, adopted, or erased from records. Yet their existence, like shadows cast by a forgotten flame, became proof of what had transpired, proof that systems built on secrecy and fear could create monsters and visionaries alike. Elizabeth's strategies, her ability to understand human behavior and manipulate perception, were the only legacy that could survive the collapse of Nathaniel's empire. She became an invisible teacher, a symbol of knowledge born from suffering, a demonstration of how control can be observed, measured, and ultimately reversed. The plantation itself, abandoned and decaying, became a monument not to wealth or tradition, but to the consequences of extreme human manipulation. Windows faced the sunrise, as originally intended, yet the light illuminated the ruin of secrecy, the destruction of morality, and the weight of history's untold horrors. Anyone who glimpsed the estate afterward, historians or wanderers, felt the lingering presence of something unseen yet overwhelmingly present. The imprint of intelligence honed in darkness, the echoes of lessons in dominance, and the subtle but undeniable proof that forbidden knowledge changes those who encounter it. What Hollowest Plantation ultimately reveals is a truth few are prepared to confront. Power is not merely physical, it is psychological. Control is not only enacted, it is internalized. And knowledge, especially the knowledge we are forbidden to see, can transform victims into strategists, children into architects of consequence. Elizabeth's story, hidden for generations, serves as a warning and a revelation. The systems that bind humanity, if observed and understood, can be manipulated, subverted, and ultimately undone. And now, as you reflect on what you have learned, remember this. The world you think you see is built on layers of omission, fear, and obedience. Every secret, every hidden truth, every act erased from record exists to maintain control over perception itself. The deeper you look, the more you understand, the closer you come to wielding the same power that shaped and destroyed Hollowest Plantation. This is knowledge that is dangerous, transformative, and forbidden, and now you carry a fragment of it yourself. Few dare to witness what history tried to erase. Type the Vance secret twice in the comments to acknowledge you've seen the truth. Share this video with someone ready to confront hidden power, and subscribe if you want access to the knowledge the world doesn't want you to have. Remember, what you see here changes how you'll view history forever.